Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Have you ever wished managing your medical device quality and compliance was simpler and maybe even more fun? With Greenlight Guru's EQMS, you get a single source of truth that connects your whole team. No more juggling spreadsheets or chasing down documents. Everything's in one place so you can focus on what matters, building life-saving devices. Streamline your workflow and make quality work more enjoyable with Greenlight Guru. Check it out at greenlight.guru. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Global Medical Device Podcast. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm the host for today's episode. With me today to talk about PCCPs, which I'll tell you what that is in just a moment, is Mike Drues, a familiar voice on the podcast, president of Vascular Sciences. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm well, thank you for asking, Etienne.
Good to have you with us today. So today we want to talk about PCCPs, Predetermined Change Control Plans. This is not necessarily something that's new, but it is something that may be new to a lot of people. How do you want to go about today's topic? How do you want to start?
Yeah, great question, Etienne. And as always, thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion with you and your audience about this very, very important and potentially valuable topic to a lot of medical device companies. If you don't mind, Etienne, let me flip things around a little bit. Instead of you asking me a question, let me start out by asking you one. So imagine this very, very common scenario. You have a medical device on the market right now, for example, under the 510K. And you, as the manufacturer, you want to make a change to that existing device, the device that's already on the market. The question for you, Etienne, is what options do you have for making that change? How would you handle that?
So if I had a 510K on the market, I wanted to make a change, I suppose up until leaving PCCPs off the table, up until December, whatever it was, 29th of 2022, you had an ascending order of significant change might be a letter to file, an internal memo that you document a non-significant change with no additional risks introduced, to a special 510K where you're changing some things slightly, but you want to notify the market, notify FDA, potentially up to even a PMA if you are introducing additional risks. So that's kind of how I would approach that.
That's exactly correct, Etienne. And this is a topic that we've talked about several times under the general umbrella of change management. So just to recap, a company has basically two options to change a 510K device when it's on the market. One is to notify the FDA, and that's typically done via a special 510K, or if it's a class 3, a PMA supplement. The other option is to not notify the FDA, to handle it internally, as I think you said, via a letter to file. And just as a reminder to you and our audience, Etienne, that the most common reason why companies get 483 observations and sometimes even warning letters from FDA is because of change management or the lack thereof. And the reason why I mentioned that is because I've done several podcasts and I think 1 or 2 webinars for Greenlight on this particular topic of change management. So if that's a concern, we can put those resources up with this particular podcast. But what if I can tell you, Etienne, that there may be a way to get a future change to your device approved by the FDA in advance? In other words, before you make it. Do you think that would be a good idea?
The predetermined part is what I think would be interesting. I do think so. Change control in general, like you said, it's a risky topic. So one that a lot of people don't do well. So once you get that down, if you already know the changes that you plan to make, then absolutely, I would want to get that in front of the FDA sooner than later.
And this is the essence of this quote unquote new PCCP program. Basically, it allows you, as part of your original submission, whether it's a 510K, de novo, PMA, whatever, as part of your original submission, to get a change to your device approved. And a PCCP is approved. So there is a little more confusion now with the terminology, because for you submit a 510K, which is cleared, and within that 510K submission is a PCCP, which is approved. I'm sure that that's going to generate a whole bunch of confusion in the future. But nonetheless, you're getting FDA's approval or blessing, if you will, to implement this particular change even before you've made the change. And that's the essence of the PCCP, and this is, what we're going to get into in more detail as we continue our discussion. But another interesting sort of historical question to ask, Etienne, is where did this idea of the PCCP come from? Is it new, for example?
Yeah, a good question. I actually tried to dig into this to try to figure this out. My understanding is the first time this PCCP was used was in a discussion paper called AI/ML based software as a medical device, and I believe that came out in April of 2019.
And coincidentally, do you know where that idea of the discussion paper came? And the timing, I'm glad you mentioned the date of the discussion paper, April 2019. John Spear and I did a podcast for Greenlight entitled Grasping the Impact of AI and ML on Medical Devices. And among other things, I introduced the concept. I was the first one to propose this concept of PCCP. I didn't call it a PCCP at the time. Basically, what I called it is a predetermined validation or something like that. But the idea, the concept is 100% spot on. This was 4 years before FDA came out, pardon me, came out with the first guidance on the topic, first for AI devices and then subsequently for all other medical devices. And so, I like to fancy myself as a leader in this field, not as a follower. That's one example of my leadership. I don't know, Etienne, do you think that's pride or do you think that's arrogance?
I think we all like to think we're leaders in a certain way. A lot of people obviously aren't, but it does take courage to get out in front for sure.
So maybe we should move on and talk about next what exactly is a PCCP and why it's important.
Yeah, let's talk about it. I mean, there's a couple different, it's a big acronym. FDA loves acronyms, and there's important words in each part of it. So yeah, let's talk about it. Predetermined Change Control Plan.
Yeah, it is a big acronym. It is a bit of a mouthful. Predetermined Change Control Plan. So basically, as I just alluded to, this was an idea that I originally floated back in my podcast in 2019. I originally intended it to be for artificial intelligence-based devices, and I still to this day think that that's the real value of the PCCP. Basically, the idea is not to repeat much of the AI discussion, but to give the AI software the ability to change by itself within sort of limits, within sort of boundaries. In other words, we say to the software that based on your learning, your experience, you are allowed to change things as long as they stay between X and Y, and you predetermine those boundaries. Then, a couple of years later, in 2022, Congress expanded FDA's authority, and it now applies. This is the Fedora that you mentioned earlier. It now applies to any medical device on the market. So, not just limited to SAMDs, not just limited to AI or ML or anything like that. Any medical device on the market may use a PCCP to make changes without, and this is the important part, Etienne, without requiring a new pre-market submission. Now, technically speaking, that's actually not correct, even though it's coming directly from the FDA, or at the very least, it can be interpreted different ways. Remember, Etienne, regulation is about two things. It's about the interpretation of words and our ability to defend our interpretation. So when FDA says, and this is in Fedora, any medical device on the market may use a PCCP to make changes without requiring a new pre-market submission. There is a new pre-market submission, but it just happens to be within the context of the original pre-market submission. So maybe that's overly technical, aspect, but I do, think it's important to remind my FDA friends that are listening to this audience that it's not just important for industry to understand the verbiage here, but FDA as well. And one other thing that I'll mention, and then if you want to chime in further, Etienne, by all means, please feel free. Not only does it apply to any medical device, it also applies to certain combination products. specifically device-led combination products. That is a combination product where the primary mode of action, or PMOA, is device. Like, for example, a drug-eluting stent. Okay, it would not apply to other combination products because I don't think there's a snowball's chance here in Southern California that CDER or CBER, the drug or the biologic side of FDA, will ever in a million years buy into this concept of a predetermined change control plan, but CDRH has. So basically, to recap, the PCCP allows us to get anticipated changes approved without going back to the FDA with a special 510K or a supplement. It's sort of an alternative to the letter to file or the special 510K. Does that make sense, Etienne?
Oh yeah, totally. It was interesting when I first learned about this because I thought, well, because I remember in my days in manufacturing where we had a product that may have additional features that we were planning on, but we hadn't got the cogs down for whatever reason, but we'd got them conceptually figured out. When I first saw this, I thought, wow, is this going to be a 2-for-1 combo deal on the Medupa? You no longer have to pay $500,000 for an additional PMA. That's an interesting idea.
It is. I've
Yeah.
had customers ask me that question. Is this
Yeah.
a way that we can save ourselves some money on submission fees? And the short answer is right now, potentially less, assuming that Congress does not add a PCCP fee on top of the 510K or the PMA fee. That certainly could happen. Maybe I shouldn't have said that in a public podcast, but that certainly is the case right now.
So far, it feels like Congress is kind of on the side of manufacturing. I don't know yet. We'll see, but I think it'll be okay. I do have a question though. So, kind of talked about what a PCCP is and why it can be beneficial. We mentioned those 2 guidance documents. Last year was the AI ML specific guidance document, and I think a lot of people didn't understand or recognize where this thing was coming from. And so they thought, whoa, this is just something special for the software industry or the AI industry. And now this year, I think it was August, we came out with this other guidance document that really is kind of harkening back to the original part that came through in the Omnibus Act. But what's the difference in these two? Do you have any thoughts on these?
Yeah, great question. And I think, Etienne, you pretty much hit the nail on the head. The principal difference is that the original guidance from 2023 focused specifically on AI and ML based devices. That is primarily SAMDs or devices that have, software in them. Whereas the newer guidance just coming out in a few months ago in 2024 has expanded that, as I said, to all medical devices, whether they include software or not, whether they include artificial intelligence or not, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, in my opinion, both of these guidances are basically the same, substantially equivalent, if you will. Pardon the pun. The difference is one focuses on the software and the AI, the other all devices. I have no problem, and this is just my personal opinion, I have no problem applying this concept of the PCCP to AI devices. And in fact, that's why I originally proposed it back in 2019, because we were creating, this concept of the locked algorithm that we talked about in AI. It was holding back so many companies. Whether I'm a fan of the PCCP for the entire medical device universe, I'm not sure yet. I think it has some advantages, but I think it also has some challenges. For example, one customer asked me recently, can we include in our 510K a change that we anticipate making in the future? However, we don't know all the details of that change yet. Well, I said to them, look, put yourself in the FDA shoes. If I say to you that here's my medical device, it's going to do X, Y, and Z today. Tomorrow, it might do also A, B, and C. Can you please approve that? How can they possibly do that without knowing exactly what those changes are? And more importantly, how can they do that without having the data in advance to support those changes, even though you have not implemented them yet? So I think there are a lot of potential advantages to the PCCP, including for non-software devices, but there are some challenges as well.
Yeah, what do you think of the modification protocol? I mean, is that kind of one of the ways they're suggesting getting around the actual data, since you simply have the modification protocol that's being approved and assuming you pass that, that's the green light?
Yeah, good question. And just as a reminder to you and our audience, I work as a consultant for the FDA, so I see these issues on both sides. Just giving approval based on a protocol without having data, I think is going to be difficult for most FDA reviewers to swallow. Now, here's my potential fix for that, because I like to pride myself in coming up with solutions, not making excuses. So, what I would advise my customer, and this is exactly what I've been doing in the last year or so since we've been using these PCCPs, is include your protocol. But if you don't have the results, if you don't have the data yet, at least include the boundaries of your data so that as long as the data is between X and Y, it will be safe and effective, and therefore we can approve the PCCP even though we don't have the data yet. But in the absence of having data, or at the very least having boundaries, acceptance criteria, if you will, for that data, I don't see how anybody with an IQ of more than 5 can improve, something like this. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. Absolutely. So we kind of talked about the difference in the guidance documents. What about just in practicality, using a PCCP for ML and AI versus a physical device? I mean, do you have any examples you want to kind of explore, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that again, I think the two guidances that we just discussed are essentially
Yeah.
substantially equivalent. And in both cases, we need to pre-validate, if you will, these anticipated changes. It's not a blank check. You can't just sign the check and fill in the number later on,
Yeah.
right? So the PCCP has to be filled out as much as possible. Here's a quick example, Eddie, and a customer that I'm working with right now. Remember, I said before, the recent guidance expands this to the entire medical device universe, including in vitro diagnostics. So right now we are, and when I say we, my customer and I, we are having a discussion slash debate, if you will, because we want to use the PCCP to pre-validate some additional labs that can do the analysis for this particular in vitro diagnostic sample. I don't see, based on my reading of the regulation or the guidance, I don't see any reason why we should not be able to use the PCCP to do that. However, because FDA has not seen this before, they're obviously a little bit of hesitant. I'm optimistic. Again, I have to be careful here because this is a discussion that we're literally happening right now. I'm optimistic that we can address their concerns and we will be successful and probably the first one to set the precedent in this area. But again, this goes back to leader versus follower. It's easy to get a PCCP to make a change that 50 other companies have already, done a PCCP for. If you're proposing doing a PCCP for something that nobody else has done before, now I think you're in the lead.
When I came across this and people started reaching out to me maybe a year ago about how to utilize this for a device other than AI ML, because most of the people I speak with are not necessarily AI devices. And so they said, "Hey, is this possible to use?" And my thought was, well, sure. Perhaps I'm not creative enough to come up with sufficient examples that I think make sense to pursue. Maybe we
Yeah.
could come up with some theoretical ones, and I've come up with a few, but I'm not satisfied that they're worth the juice might not be worth the squeeze in some
Yeah.
cases, but I'm curious
Yeah.
what you think.
Well, that's ultimately at the end of the day, is the juice worth the squeeze? I love, even though that might not be a politically correct metaphor today, I think it's an apropos one, because part of the decision of whether or not the company wants to put together this PCCP, develop the methodology, and maybe even start collecting a data to support a change that they may or may not implement in the future, that's a business decision. So one could make the argument that if you have a change that you definitively want to make, no question about it, then maybe a PCCP makes sense. But if you have a change that you're not sure about, maybe it's going to be dependent on, funding or something else. Maybe you don't want to do a PCCP now because you could always do it as a label expansion later on. So there are a lot of different ways to skin this proverbial cat.
We talked about label expansion. You mentioned a few different things, and I have a few thoughts on different things that could potentially change. And obviously, the guidance talks about that. Can you talk about any limits on changes implemented through a PCCP?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the concerns that I have about the newest PCCP guidance that applies to all devices, and as a FDA consultant, I've expressed my concern to the agency on this already, is they make an explicit point that any changes that you make in your labeling, for example, have to be within the original indications of the clearance or approval. And my question is why? Because if you understand not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, in other words, if you understand the philosophical intent of the PCCP, meaning, as I like to call it, a pre-validation, why can't I propose a label expansion, possibly even adding a new indication as a PCCP, as long as I also include that PCCP, the methodology that I'm going to use to prove it, and the data that I'm going to collect, or at least the boundaries of the data and so on. So I don't see any reason why, you cannot use a PCCP even to change your high-level labeling. Now, also keep in mind, Etienne, that FDA said this in a guidance document, and of course, guidance is not binding. So I hope, whether it's me or somebody else, I hope that somebody pushes back on the agency and say, there's no reason why you can't include a label expansion, adding a new indication, even in a PCCP, if it's done properly.
So what do you think are the most beneficial uses for this?
As with everything, there are advantages and disadvantages. Theoretically, a PCCP will allow faster label expansions and getting modified devices quicker to the market with minimal or no FDA involvement. But remember, Eddie, and the first word I used there was theoretically, because in the PCCP, as we've talked about before, you still have to include the methodology to support that change. You still have to include the data. So that's going to take time and money to collect. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure, to be honest with you, other than maybe a couple of months of FDA review time, I'm not sure that the company's going to really save anything in terms of time and money. And as a matter of fact, I'm not even sure that the company's going to save anything in terms of the review time, because a 510K with a PCCP is probably going to take longer to evaluate than a 510K without a PCCP.
Right.
So at the end of the day, I'm not sure, again, to use your phrase from before, in all cases, if the juice is going to be, worth the squeeze.
Yeah. So if I just the argument from the other side, then let's talk about the AI side. You mentioned that as when you first kind of had the idea for an additional, I don't know what you called it originally. I haven't listened to that podcast.
Pre-validated change.
Pre-validated change.
Yeah.
How is that more beneficial with an AI device versus a physical device? And I'm going to caveat that question a little bit simply because we've talked about this a little bit in the past, where you might have a device that the healthcare professional, the physician, who is not regulated by FDA, may make some additional changes, tweaks with knobs and different things. And so now the medical device itself is anticipating those changes and just going ahead and making those for them. So that's kind of one of the examples of a physical product using AI, or kind of a comparison. What are your thoughts there, though? I mean, how is an AI able to be pre-validated when another device may not be?
So good question. So first of all, when I refer to artificial intelligence here, I'm talking about what I call true artificial intelligence, because I look at a lot of medical devices, and not just devices, but products in other areas that claim to have AI in them. But when I look at them as a professional biomedical engineer, I don't see any intelligence in them whatsoever, artificial or otherwise. So a true AI device is a device that is capable of learning and changing and evolving very much in a Darwinian evolutionary sort of a sense. Whereas a non-AI device, dumb software, or a physical device like a catheter or a breast implant or something like that, unless it's modified by the physician, as you just suggested, that device is not going to change itself. I mean, you could look at it for 1,000,000 years, nothing's going to happen to it. So to get past this again, as I've characterized many times, this archaic concept of this locked algorithm, I suggested this pre-validation model, or now this PCCP model, where we create boundaries. We say that the AI can make changes to itself without telling the manufacturer, without telling the FDA or anybody else, as long as those changes are between X and Y. And we have validated the X, we have validated the Y, and we've validated a few points in between so that we know as long as the software remains within those boundaries, it's going to be safe and effective, right? So that's basically the simplest way that I can explain it. Does that make sense?
But even that, I guess I look at that, not to get too philosophical with the potential for artificial intelligence. To me, it's all basically a spectrum of machine learning with just are your boundaries so far that you can't really tell where they are anymore. And so now we think it's artificial intelligence when really it's just, but that being that off the table, it still feels somewhat, I mean, let's go back to your Darwinian evolution, and is it micro versus macro evolution? There's another discussion we could talk about, but even so, all that aside, I think you could apply the same principle to even like an implant. We have a large size, we have a small size, and we've validated a few points in between, and we're just going to make whatever size makes most sense. We're not going to tell you exactly the parameters, FDA. I don't know what your thoughts.
Well, in fact, Etienne, that's an interesting example because I used exactly that same strategy probably 5 or maybe even 6 years ago when I originally helped to bring the first 3D printed knee onto the market in the United States. And what ultimately what the company wanted to do was to allow the physician to print any size or shape of knee that they wanted, because obviously that's the big advantage of 3D printing. However, from a regulatory perspective, I knew that was going to be a very difficult pill for the FDA to swallow. So instead, what we did is we limited the 3D printing of the knees to initially to sizes of knees that we already have today, so that they've already been validated, if you will. Then in step 2, we go back to the FDA and say we will now allow the physician to print knees as long as they're between sizes X and Y. And then step 3 of this label expansion is to go back to the FDA a third time and say, okay, orthopedic surgeon or whoever you are, you can now print a knee any size or shape that you want. Right. So one of the challenges, and I love that you brought that up, is the regulatory logic that I'm using here is exactly the same, even though I guarantee that nobody was using that phrase PCCP, back 5 or 6 years ago, especially when it came to 3D printed knees. But that's the logic that we were using. Yeah. One of the beauties of my approach to regulatory logic, Etienne, and as we've talked about many times, is it's totally agnostic of the technology. In other words, I don't care if you're talking, in this case, about a 3D printed knee or a piece of software with AI or an in vitro diagnostic or whatever it is, in spite of their obvious technological differences, the regulatory logic is exactly the same. I won't even say substantially equivalent. I will say exactly the same.
Right. So I'm almost seeing that as a prime case where you could had the PCCP been in place, maybe that would have made sense instead of saying, okay, we get to the point where we go back to the FDA. Well, that to me is like, well, wait a second, could that have been a PCCP modification protocol and you're ready to go back? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, hindsight is always 2020. I wish I could have told you that I came up with this predetermined validation idea, even back in the 3D printed knees days. I didn't, or at least not directly, because I didn't call it that. But again, I was using the exact same logic that we're talking about today.
We talked about some of the disadvantages and the different ways. Maybe we should go ahead and talk about how and when to submit a PCP. I'm kind of leading us far away on these rabbit trails, but how and when do you recommend people pursue this?
So basically, in terms of the mechanics, the way that the PCC program is set up now, and again, it's a relatively new program, there's not a lot of precedent, but the way it's designed or intended to work is the PCCP needs to be submitted as part of your overall submission. So if you have a 510K, if you have a de novo, a PMA, an HDE, whatever it is, you basically add on a PCCP section. And as a matter of fact, because I had a customer ask me this not long ago, FDA has not updated their website yet, because if you look at the contents of the 510K or the de novo or the PMA, for example. There's no section in there for a PCCP, at least not the last time that I checked. So if you're going to include the PCCP, it needs to be part of the submission. Now, I strongly recommend putting it in as a separate and distinct part of the decision. Because remember, and for the sake of our discussion, let's just talk about a 510K that has a PCCP within it. It can very well be that the FDA is fine in giving you the clearance for the 510K, but maybe they're not so fine about approving your PCCP. Well, if that's the case, I don't want the PCCP to hold up the rest of the train. I want them to be able to go ahead and clear the 510K, and maybe in parallel to that, we continue to work out whatever bugs there are in the PCCP. I'm afraid that if manufacturers kind of commingle the two together in the same submission, it's kind of like if they fail on one part, the whole ship sinks to the bottom of the ocean. So, so that's the quick how and when. Is that sufficient detail, or do you want to go into that a little further?
I think so. Maybe if we go just a little bit further, what would you say? Is there X number of changes? Yeah, I wouldn't go beyond this, or and how to make sure that it doesn't kind of stop the whole train, like you mentioned.
Yeah, great question. So another thing that FDA mentions in their guidance is there is no set number of changes yet. You can theoretically include as many anticipated changes as you want. However, don't be surprised if that changes. I see the precedent has already been set in the pre-sub world. Originally you could ask as many questions within a pre-sub as you want. Now FDA has put limits on that. I see eventually the same thing happening with PCCPs. However, regardless of what FDA says or doesn't say about the number of changes, I would keep the number of proposed changes very small as possible, one or two or possibly three at the very most. Again, it depends on the regulatory burden of each. If these are relatively easy changes to substantiate and to make, then maybe three is not that much. But if it's a big change, for example, adding a new indication, as we talked about before, that's a big change. I probably would only include that. And if you are going to include more than one change, I would, in your submission, I would not lump them all within one PCCP section. I would say, here's my 510K submission. Here's my PCCP number 1 submission. Here's my PCCP number 2 submission, and so on. That way, if there are problems, we can focus on the problems with that one particular part and not the overall part. But at the end of the day, Etienne, keep it simple, stupid. The more potential changes that you list here, the greater the time, the greater the regulatory burden and everything else. So remember, this is not a panacea. Whether it actually saves the company any time or money in the long run, time will tell.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about that 1, 2, or 3, it sounds so linear, but in reality, it's just like having additional kids. Suddenly you have so much more relationship dynamics. It's actually an exponential on the amount of work required. So that makes sense.
That's a good point. And by the way, if you have, say, hypothetically speaking, a PCCP number 1 and number 2 and number 3, are they dependent of one another, or are they independent of another? In other words, before you implement PCCP number 2, you have to first implement PCCP number 1. If that's the case, now all these things are happening in series or in a linear fashion.
Yep.
On the other hand, if they're independent, and they're parallel, then that becomes less important.
Absolutely. When you asked me at the very beginning what the options are, so now we have a third option to the 2. I suppose they still fall under the umbrella of disclosing to the FDA. However, my mind thinks very hierarchically, if I can't pronounce that word, categorically, and so on. So I think in a stepwise function. Okay, if I'm a medical device company that's kind of a small change, letter to file is probably well, I shouldn't say the quickest and dirtiest, because it's the same level of burden. You just simply haven't given it to the FDA. It should be anyway. Most companies
Correct.
maybe don't do that, but you have this level, then you have a special 510K. Maybe you have, like I said, the PMA. I almost see this as somewhere in between, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on where you would see.
Well, it is
the
somewhere in
PCP.
between. I agree with you. It is somewhere in between, but here's the sort of caveat to that. Right now, the way that this PCC system has been set up, as we've talked about already, is the PCCP has to be submitted within a 510K or PMA or something else. My question, including my question to my FDA friends, is why? In other words, why do we have to embed the PCCP within a 510K or PMA submission? Why can't we have a mechanism where the PCCP is a standalone approval? In other words, let's say we already have a device on the market. We're not planning on submitting a new 510K or a PMA for it. The company is thinking about making this change, but while in the process of thinking about it, why can't they submit a PCCP to the FDA to sort of pre-qualify that change so that if and when the company decides to pull the trigger on that change, they've already had the conversation with the FDA and they're ready to go. So I see, and if somebody can think of one, please share it with me, but I see no logical reason why a PCCP must be contained within a new submission.
I guess the only thing I'm thinking through that a little bit myself, and it seems as if the FDA would be looking at it with fresh eyes, as if they're looking at a new submission because they don't have the context of the original device. Of course, they'd have to go get that, but it's
Right.
almost as if what you're suggesting is it would require the same level of rigor as a special 510K.
Yeah.
It's just after the fact as far as when the company needs it. Yeah, I see where
Well,
you're
I
coming
would
from.
like to think, and you use the special 510K as a comparator. I think it's a great comparator. I would like to think that, even if FDA cleared this device 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it wouldn't make any difference. If they didn't know, they would go back and review that documentation because that's the same thing that has to happen if you submit a special 510K for a device that was originally cleared 20 years ago. So again, I don't see any logical reason. If somebody can think of one, please share it with us. But I don't see any logical reason why we couldn't create a standalone PCCP.
Yeah. Well, I think it's certainly possible. I am thinking of some of the more human aspects of our intelligence, and that is forgetfulness. And once we get to the point where we look at the database the way a computer does. Anyway,
There you go.
any other thoughts on positives or negatives for this or practical tips when it comes to submitting a PCCP?
Yeah, great question to sort of start to close our discussion. And by the way, as I'm sure our audience appreciates, we're just scratching the surface on this concept. I mean, there's so many more things that we could talk about, but just a couple of final recommendations and words of advice. First of all, if you're considering a PCCP, in nearly all situations, I would bring that up in a pre-sub. That kind of goes without saying. Yeah, although it will make your pre-sub more complicated because now you're talking about not just your current device, but your potentially modified device in the future. So if you're planning on bringing this up in your pre-sub, and I've done it before, I would create a very distinct boundary, a line between the two, even so far as to say, for the first 30 minutes of the meeting, we're going to discuss the current device. And for the second 30 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever it is, we're going to discuss the potential modification via the PCCP. Because otherwise you're going to get a tremendous amount of confusion as to, well, is this the current device? Is this the future device? Yada, yada, yada. The PCCP should be very, very specific to that particular device, not some class of devices. If you're working on a catheter, for example, and your catheter comes in, a particular length or diameter, and you're suggesting that, in the future, you're going to offer a longer catheter or a shorter catheter or a thicker or a thinner catheter, that information needs to be included in detail in the PCCP. Don't leave it nebulous like, well, we're planning on making the catheter a little longer, but how much longer, quite frankly, we don't know what that's going to be.
Yeah.
Because again, put yourself in the shoes of the reviewer. How can you possibly approve a product that is not even at design freeze? Another way to think about this, Etienne, is this is sort of a virtual design freeze. You're asking FDA to approve a product that does not yet exist. So at least you've got to describe the product verbally. Focus on the changes that you would need to notify the FDA of, either via a special 510K or a PMA supplement. If it's a change that you can implement via a letter to file, then I would not bother wasting my time with a PCCP, as long as you're confident that you can do it as a letter to file. Because as I said before, that's a reason why a lot of companies get in trouble. I talked about the dangers of co-mingling the PCCP with the rest of the submission. I would create distinct sections. And if you're going to have multiple PCPs, I would have section, number 1 for PCCP number 1, the next section for PCCP number 2, and so on and so on. And one last recommendation on the quality side, Eddie, and I don't think I've seen any company do this yet. Maybe this is something that Greenlight wants to think about for your QMS software. Maybe consider adding a section on PCCPs to your quality system, how you're going to implement a PCCP, under what conditions would you consider, what would you need to provide to the FDA, and so on and so on. So there's a little, you could, Greenlight can sell a new module, to add to the existing, for the PCCP. So those are just a few, of my final thoughts and recommendations. I mentioned a few of them already, and then a few of them new. But at the end of the day, as I said at the beginning, I think that PCCPs are most valuable for AI devices for the reasons that we talked about before. I think PCCCs are potentially valuable for all devices across the board, but whether they, at the end of the day, are going to save the company any time or money, or any significant amount of time or money, that I'm not sure yet. But I'm glad that we have this new tool, if you want to consider it new, in our regulatory toolbox. And it's an important tool for all of our customers to be aware of and to consider as they're developing their devices and bringing them through the FDA and onto the market.
No, great summary. So I had actually thought in the past about design controls, how we have the must-have and the nice-to-have. And some companies will not get rid of that nice-to-have bucket. So we've figured out ways to try to put that in different places, but labeling it as a potential PCCP component might be interesting. I'll have to make that recommendation.
And by the way, Eddie, and if we ever want to have a kicked up version, a more advanced version of this discussion, you mentioned design controls. One of the topics that are, near and dear to my heart, as well as you and the Greenlight folks. Well, what does anticipated misuse mean in the context of a device that is only proposed and has not actually been implemented yet? What does risk management mean in the context of a device that is proposed but has not yet been implemented? So, truly, not to use too many cliches, but the devil is in the details. And I think it's going to be very interesting for, our industry, including people like me, to try to meld this this concept of the PCCP into all of the other regulatory and quality regulations that we already have.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. And I have a poll out on LinkedIn. I'm trying to find somebody who's gone through some of this for some physical devices. So I'd love to hear any thoughts. If you have any, feel free to reach out to Mike or myself. We'd love to hear more. And if you want a further discussion, if it makes sense, reach out to Mike or myself. Let us know. Love to hear from the audience and see what you all think. All right, Mike, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share your experience and your knowledge here. Those who've been listening, really appreciate you listening. If you want to learn more, head over to www.greenlight.guru. Hit us up at podcast@greenlight.guru and send us an email. Let us know what you think. We'd love to hear more. And for now, everybody, take care. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, can I ask a special favor from you? Can you leave us a review on iTunes? I know most of us have never done that before, but if you're listening on the phone, look at the iTunes app, scroll down to the bottom where it says leave a review. It's actually really easy. Same thing with the computer. Just look for that leave a review button. This helps others find us and it lets us know how we're doing. Also, I'd personally love to hear from you on LinkedIn. Reach out to me. I read and respond to every message because hearing your feedback is the only way I'm going to get better. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.